Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to DCRI Research Conference. It's a real pleasure today to introduce Adrian Hernandez, who has a guest on their way. They had some flight delays, but there'll be a co-investigator joining Adrian shortly, so pardon the interruption up front that'll happen at some point. And I'll let Adrian introduce his colleague. But Adrian, most people know, but just by way of introduction, Adrian started his career as an undergrad at Rice University and then went to UT Southwestern for medical school, after which he trained in internal medicine at UCSF and then came to Duke for cardiology and advanced heart failure training. And after his training, he quickly joined the ranks of DCRI and quickly rose through the ranks. Has acquired a number of leadership positions, including Associate Director of the DCRI, a number of national leadership positions on national committees for the NHLBI and a variety of professional organizations, and also been honored with a number of different honors, including ASCII election a couple years ago. So with that, please welcome Adrian Hernandez.
All right, thanks. Actually, it looks like we have perfect timing. So welcome, Leslie. Research conference is always kind of an interesting forum. It can be a little bit vulnerable because we're presenting stuff that's really works in progress. But today I actually feel even more vulnerable in a couple ways. One, I'm going to talk about a therapeutic area, stroke, which is not really my primary therapeutic area, but there's a lot of things that are happening there that we can address and help out that community. Two is going to use this forum a little bit as an experiment, do something different. And we have one of our patient co-investigators here, and we're going to spend some time chatting with her about her experience and actually joining kind of the research team and Corey and Prosper and what that means perhaps for patients as well as the clinical community. And then third, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we'd like to do in the future in outcomes research and actually hopefully hear from you all some ideas about maybe some of the things that are working and perhaps things that we really should consider as we go forward. So Leslie actually just arrived literally from Buffalo via Philadelphia, and the usual Philadelphia transit of delays or missed flights. That's right. So, and I've promised her that the audience here is more like Oprah as opposed to Jerry Springer. So when we get to that part, hopefully you guys can be very kind. And then hopefully don't ask too many questions about, really what it is to work with us yet, because we're really just beginning. Here's my disclosures, but let me start off with one other disclosure. And I know everyone in the room is a fan of Twitter and is following the trends over time. And so my first question to you guys is, which Hernandez is the top hit on Twitter in the last 36 hours? So, does anyone have the answer? Aaron Hernandez? Not quite, but also relevant, and I'm not related. Okay, second chance? Keith Hernandez? No. Third chance? Not quite. So the Super Bowl featured Peter Hernandez, a.k.a. Bruno Mars. And so I was at a Super Bowl party, and so when someone was doing the bio about Bruno Mars, noting that he was related to, that he's actually Peter Hernandez, quickly was consumed by multiple questions about how I was related to Peter. And more importantly, did I have the moves that he does? So the first answer, what Twitter says, is no, but I do have soul in my steps. If Leslie hadn't showed up, you could have seen that, but we'll have to save that for a later day. So this we're going to go through for the next 40 minutes or so, just talk a little bit about why, at least I think, and have tried to convince Eric, that outcomes matters in our outcomes research group really matters, and talk a little bit about why outcomes matter a lot. And then use Prosper, which is really kind of a new effort for all of us in terms of doing research side by side with patients, and highlight three forces that are going on right now in terms of the focus of value of care, the thousands of questions that people have every day, either from patients or in the clinics, and then also really the engagement of the patient and hearing their voice. And then we'll actually talk to a real live patient and see what she has to say, and talk a little bit about the future, at least what our group would like to see in terms of accelerating outcomes research, which is actually a pretty hard challenge for us already, given that outcomes research for the US really, in many ways, was founded here under the leadership of Dan Mark and Eric, and has always been oriented towards changing care, changing outcomes. So why does outcomes research matter? And you can't go very far in terms of looking at headlines and seeing every day in the news the story about the US economy, the budget, and why healthcare matters. And the reason for that is that while everyone has focused on the top line, which is the total spending, and noticeably the gap between the top line and the next line, which is the deficit spending and revenues, the key thing is actually the components of this, which is, if you look here at this green line, how it continues to rise faster than other areas, and soon will overtake really all other spending in healthcare. And so this is really why Obama and others have made this really a US economic issue in terms of how can we compete with the rest of the world or face the risk of being essentially owned by other countries. And then when you think about Medicare, and this is a slide I stole from Schulman, is if you look at what we put into Medicare today, all of us here in this room, versus what we expect to get out of it, it's a pretty large difference. So the top blue line is actually what's the mean amount of Medicare costs that we put in, and this bottom is the total expected expense from beneficiaries that we have. And you can see $200,000 is greater than 75. And so that calculation does not add up, and so that's why there's such intense focus on bending the cost curve, addressing issues in terms of hospitalizations, addressing issues in terms of preventive care, addressing issues in terms of variability of care, such as high-ticket items such as imaging, procedures, and the like, and then also making sure that we get the best bang for our buck in terms of value of care for the choices that we have every day. And if you project this over time, in 2040, it looks like that if you can combine all the Social Security, is actually more stable than Medicare, that essentially the total percent of federal income that comes in from tax revenues will be 3/4 spent on Social Security and Medicare. And so that's why now it's really imperative for us to address these issues directly, define what are the best benefits for choices that we have in therapies, and also focus on things that may actually prevent long-term problems. Now, one obvious question is, why is someone who's clinically oriented in heart failure doing anything with stroke? And while now we take care of a lot of patients with ventricular assist devices, which have unfortunately still a common complication of stroke, and have seen more strokes than probably any time in my cardiology practice, and have used actually more thrombolytics than probably anyone else in cardiology for the last several years. It is in some ways different compared to acute stroke, but actually there's a lot of similarities. So if you compare acute heart failure to acute ischemic stroke, it's about the same in terms of 1 million hospitalizations for heart failure, 700,000 for ischemic stroke. If you include other strokes, 800,000. Then patient mortality is actually higher for a stroke. The 30-day mortality among Medicare beneficiaries is about the same at 12 to 14%. And it's virtually guaranteed that after a stroke, that someone will either come back in the hospital or unfortunately pass away with about 2/3. And then if you look at the evidence behind what we do for either one of these conditions, it's actually pretty scant. So the actually clinical trials directly that evaluate things regarding acute heart failure is just over 3,000. For acute ischemic stroke, it's just under 2,000. That's not to say that there isn't a ton of literature out there about stroke, about the pathophysiology, about how it's common, et cetera. But getting directly to answers that can help patients, help clinicians, that is what we have. And if you look at what's out there in terms of information, doing a Google search, you can find millions of spots to get information, but there's actually really hard to kind of coalesce something that would be valid, robust, something that can actually help patients directly and have a single source of information that is sound and also patient-centered. And if you think about this, it's pretty shocking given what already is out there for our population. Nearly 7 million live with a history of a stroke survivors. It's more common in women. If you just think about how often a stroke happens, every 40 seconds, someone is having a stroke. And if you think about the recurrent strokes, it's quite large, and that actually becomes a really devastating event after having a stroke already. It's one of the most feared problems in healthcare right now. And if you think about people who die, it's every 4 minutes. And then it's quite costly, and that $39 billion is about the same as heart failure. And one of the things that we've often focused on is kind of early on when someone comes in with a stroke. What can we do better in terms of treating them acutely, breaking up the clot? And there's actually going to be a very interesting late-breaking study presented next week at the International Stroke Committee, focusing on that area in terms of actually how to improve time to thrombolysis using Get With The Guideline Stroke, and the team here was very pivotal in terms of doing that work. Other areas have also focused on issues in terms of long-term sequelae or prevention, such as tissue protection as well as regeneration. But when you talk to patients, this is not as important as perhaps all these other things. So really the effects of stroke. So what are the issues in terms of cognitive emotional effects? What problems can I get improvement in terms of memory, depression, aphasia? Other quality of life effects, including financial, being able to carry out daily tasks such as driving, being able to do grocery shopping, safety, especially if you're in this time of year in the winter where things get icy. And then also physical effects, things that are commonly thought of in terms of, say, visual changes, but things that perhaps we take for granted, such as sleep disturbances or fatigue or pain. Those are things that are common problems among stroke survivors, but yet little answers in terms of how to address that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say anything about risk stratification and Framingham, especially with the new attention to guidelines for risk stratification. And especially as Michael Pensina is here now saying that we can now forecast 30 years in the future. And so I should probably get a more updated slide here. But if you look at the estimated 10-year risk in adults, and you look at the risk factors that are in the bottom here, so in column F, which includes risk factors of high blood pressure, diabetes, cigarette smoking, AFib, and prior cardiovascular disease, almost a quarter risk for having a stroke. Certainly, these are modifiable, but if you look at just the patients who have high blood pressure and diabetes, a risk of 8 to 6%. So this is something that is certainly identifiable, something that we can address, but then also afterwards need to try and improve recurrent issues of stroke. There's also significant differences among men and women. So you can see here in the first column is the stroke incidence by white men And then the third column is by black men. And then second and fourth is also white women versus black women. So you can see there's a significant differences not only by sex, but also by race. And why is that is uncertain. And where do we live? We live in the stroke belt. So it's a little bit humbling to see that when you can go and put a pin on Durham, North Carolina, and find that we live in the middle of the stroke belt, yet we have so many questions that are unanswered, and it's all around us that we need to do something about this. So this is, again, not only kind of a problem nationally, but also a problem locally for our colleagues. And then getting back to the value of care, because we do have to have something that will support society, is if the total estimated cost of stroke forecasted to 2030 is estimated nearly $100 billion. And imagine what that would be used if you had choices in terms of spending that money on teachers, spending it on other programs in society. So let me go and specifically talk about Prosper and what we're doing here or about to do. And one of the things that comes up with PCORI is that there are 4 questions that anything with PCORI really needs to address. And those are, given my personal characteristics, conditions, and preferences, what should I expect to happen? What are my options, and what are the potential benefits and harms of those options? And what can I do to improve the outcomes that are most important to me? And those are 3 questions that we are very focused on for the Prosper grant. The 4th one is also important, but it's about how can clinicians and care delivery systems, they work and help make the best decisions. And we will have something related to that in terms of our dissemination, but the first 3 are our primary focus. One noticeable thing is that we don't yet have a logo, but we have options. And what Prosper stands for, I had to put it on here to remind myself, but patient-centered research into outcome stroke patients prefer and effectiveness research. These logos are something we're going to take to our patients and stakeholders and committee members to see what version they like or other iterations. So with great appreciation to Emily for putting together most of these, and then we'll work together with our patients to refine these. And then if we have time, we'll come back and maybe let you guys vote on one of these. So the rationale behind Prosper is fairly simple. In our conversations with stroke survivors, there are 2 themes that came out. Long-term medication safety and effectiveness are of concern. So I get medications, how long do I need to be on it? What's it going to matter for me? Is this going to change how I feel? What will this do? And also, it's you can't ignore what comes across the news every day in terms of side effects or problems. And then also, specifically, stroke survivors wonder how certain medications impacted key things that matter for them. So time at home. It's not just survival. It's like actually having time at home, being outside of a hospital, being outside of an institution. Quality of life, activities of daily living, functional status, fatigue, depression, and anxiety. All these things, some of which we had thought of as investigators, but some of which we actually didn't until we worked with our stroke survivors, especially these ideas about fatigue and anxiety and depression. And then the other gaps is that there are a bunch of different medications I could pick. Should I just go with what's on my formulary? Should I go with whatever the cheapest is? So how do I know which was the best medication for me? How long should I take it? And what are the trade-offs between health versus long-term effects? So we translated this into these aims, which is to develop a national platform to identify outcomes most desired and prioritized by patients, as well as evaluate treatment options. We focused on comparative effectiveness in 3 areas chosen by our patients. That is oral anticoagulation, statin therapy, and antidepressant therapy. And of note, when we first submitted this, we had something here for thrombolytics and acute stroke. And that was dinged by the reviewers, but then more importantly, when we had better patient engagement, there was really no questions for them in that part. And so it didn't actually resonate because at the time of acute stroke, they want to get everything as fast as possible. And so that was not of great interest for them. And then importantly, as I've said, antidepressant therapy is another area. And then after we do comparative effectiveness analysis, we want to get this out to people where they can have easy access to make decisions, and that's to have decision aids with our partner, American Heart Association, so people can understand and make their own decisions for the choices they may have. How are we doing this? So we're leveraging existing infrastructure in partnership with AHA, and that's the Get Well the Guideline Stroke. It's about 1,500 hospitals. It covers the vast majority of strokes that happen every day in the US. It's the largest registry worldwide in stroke. And then also we're leveraging past experience here, actually talking to patients directly through the call center with Avail as the main study that was started about adherence, and then we'll augment this as well and augment Get Well the Guideline Stroke with linkage to Medicare data for long-term outcomes. For the prospective part, we're actually going to be contacting patients directly to have patient-reported outcomes at 3 and 6 months, and we'll contact about 2,000 patients after their stroke. And we'll link this back into Get Well the Guidelines. And then this will be a way for us to understand some of those outcomes that aren't really identifiable through usual methods, such as Medicare claims. This is our stakeholder committee. So we have representation from leadership of AHA, the American Association of Neuroscience Nurses, CDC. We have actually the largest healthcare system, HCA, represented, as well as others, health policy experts, patients and care partners in the VA. This is the team, and we're actually just adding another member to our patient co-investigator group. And we also have, we have the luxury of also partnering with a very smart, highly responsive external experts, Greg Fonero and Lee Schwam, and then also a former DCRI alum, Dawei Olson, is part of this. And just to briefly talk about what we're planning to do in these different areas. So stroke and anticoagulation, which is being led by Ying, the main thing is that warfarin's been around forever. Many patients receive warfarin but still have inadequate anticoagulation, have frequent lab tests and dietary restrictions. There are a lot of novel oral anticoagulants out there, but the choices in this setting is uncertain in terms of what's the risk-benefit ratio after a stroke. And really to understand this in the real world where patients haven't been typically represented in some of these clinical trials. When you go to our patient panel, this is what they come up with. So the stroke survivor focus groups and patient investigators knew that there is this uncertainty about the risk and benefits of these agents, especially the new ones. And the other thing which is interesting is that while we pay attention to bleeding as a risk or risk of a recurrent stroke, they were quite concerned about other things such as quality of life or fatigue that hasn't been quite evaluated in some of the trials. Moving on in terms of stroke and statins, certainly there's high risk for recurrent stroke and other cardiovascular events. There have been some trials showing that statins do improve outcomes, but the efficacy may be exaggerated because those are generally younger patients. Those may not represent what we see in everyday life in stroke. And there's never really been any direct comparison of high versus less intensive statin therapy. And this turns out to be really important because of side effects of higher doses of statins. What do our focus groups say? They talk about significant concerns regarding the long-term exposure of statins and whether there's differences between that for things like home time. There are a lot of worries about just reflexive prescriptions. So on the one hand, while we have really endorsed and pushed forward performance measures to drive improvement of quality of care, there's some concerns that that becomes such a rote process and a checkbox that we're not individualizing treatments based on a patient's current conditions, preferences, or values. And also, what is the time horizon for that? So like the time horizon for, say, someone who's 50 because of stroke and their preferences may be very different than, say, someone who's 80. And so how is that being considered? And there's obvious concerns about prescribing habits influenced by pharma. That may be less so, at least in an environment like Duke, but that is still a major concern from patients in terms of how things are detailed and how we prescribe therapies. The last area, depression, is quite interesting because it wasn't quite on our radar when we started this, but the patients brought this out. And that it's a common problem after stroke, affects about 40%, is associated with post-stroke mortality. Depressed patients may be less likely to adhere to therapies or treatments, participate in rehab, and experience problems with sleep and appetite. And there also may be some positive benefits here that haven't been fully evaluated, such as improvement in neurologic deficits, anxiety, and functional status. And there's many small studies that address that, but nothing that's been really large, certainly no large trials. And what our focus groups talked about is they describe this as a common yet unaddressed problem. Depression and anxiety is common. This is something that they care about, but seemingly the physicians have not cared as much about. And there are all these other potential benefits, so-called the pluripotent effects of antidepressants have been seen or is on the web, and that can then improve speed of stroke recovery and quality of life. So one of the things that we've done to go through this, and we've already done part of this, which is really before submitting, is working with our focus groups to identify things that matter, so areas of importance, and also outcomes that matter, and then have gone through refinement. And this is kind of the list of outcomes that have come up, and we have various measures that actually get back to these outcomes. And moving forward, we're meeting with Leslie today to go through some of this in a working meeting, and then next week we have our a steering committee meeting where we'll be meeting with our stakeholders and patients as well to go through more of this and actually have the plan that we can execute going forward. So next, let me we'll take a break here from me talking and have Leslie come up here. And one question here for you guys is why would I take on this risky experiment? This is going to really open me up to potential things, and it could completely flop. I have that concern, but after seeing the Denver Broncos and Peyton Manning, I have no fear. And the choices for you guys are, reason to do this is C does stand for clinical in the DCRI. It's a chance to hear the patient's voice. It does, admittedly, I'm disclosing all conflicts, less slides, or D, all the above. So any comments on which is the right answer? All of the above. Okay, all right. Well, Leslie, why don't you come up here?
I want to know where the fireplace is. He said we were going to have a fireside chat. So.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay.
Hi, everybody.
So I'm going to give you this.
Okay.
So, so Leslie, thanks for sitting down with us. So
Sure.
the group here is a mixture of people who work at DCRI, who are physicians, nurses, staff, statisticians, a lot of different people, and the they're, like I said, they're nice. They're more Oprah Winfrey style as opposed to Jerry Springer. And one of the things that has come up in general is just, what a patient's experience is. Why would you even bother going from Buffalo to Philly, miss a flight, come to Durham? So maybe just at least initially tell us, what your story is in terms of stroke and why you care.
Okay. Well, I had my stroke. It was 5 years ago in October, and I was at work. I was a workaholic, and it was a Sunday night around 8 o'clock, and I was in the building by myself trying to get a mailing ready that had to go out on Monday. And I was sitting at the computer typing, and all of a sudden my left hand wasn't doing what my brain was telling it to do. So I knew something was seriously wrong, and I went to stand up out of my chair to walk across the room to the phone to call 911, and my leg gave out on me, so my stroke affected my left side. And I sort of slid off the chair. I'm just really grateful that I didn't, crack my head or anything. And I knew I wasn't going to be able to reach the phone from the floor because the phone was up on the desk. So I army crawled. It was a God thing. I can only give it to him. I army crawled across the floor to my phone, to my purse, which was on the floor, and I knew my cell phone was in there. So I got my cell phone out and I called 911. And luckily, I still had my thinking and my speech, although my speech was slurred. And when I got the 911 operator on the phone, I said, "Please don't think I'm drunk, but I think I'm having a stroke." And she asked me some questions, and I answered the best way that I could. I didn't know the exact address of the building where I was. It was sort of an annex building to the company that I worked for. And I don't know if it was the GPS signal or what, but they finally figured out where I was, and they came. And of course I was locked in because I was there by myself. So the firemen were running around the building trying to find a window that was unlocked before they tried breaking down the door. So they did find a window that was unlocked, and someone came in, but the hallway was too narrow to bring in the gurney, so they had to carry me out and put me on the gurney. And it was an October night. It was the night before my 54th birthday. And they put me on the gurney, and all I remember thinking was how beautiful the sky was and how full of stars it was. And it was, fresh air, and I had really kind of given it to God. I would never have been able to get through all this without my faith. And I just said, "God, I know you're with me, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I know you're with me, and you're going to take care of me." And I had tried to call my son, and so he didn't know where I worked, but I was trying to give him directions, and he got there just as the ambulance was leaving, and he just stayed right behind the ambulance to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, there was talk about giving me that shot, the TPA shot, but I'm on Coumadin because I had open heart surgery in 1997 to replace my mitral valve. So they couldn't give me the TPA because I was on Coumadin. And it turns out the reason I had the stroke was because I was non-therapeutic on my Coumadin, and I threw a clot from my valve that traveled up to my brain.
So I'm just going to comment on that one thing that you just said about how they didn't give you Coumadin because, they didn't give you TPA because they knew you were in Coumadin but didn't know anything else. So
right.
it turns out, and we'll chat more about this later, but Ying, who's on our team, and Eric, the director here, have done a study addressing that question, essentially saying that should have been done if we had the right answers.
Right.
So that's a very interesting thing.
Yeah. So anyway, Before I had the stroke, I was a one thing at a time person. After the stroke, I'm even more that way, like I can't multitask at all. So I had 5 people around my bed asking me questions all at the same time. And I finally just lost it. And I said, one at a time. I sat up in the bed and I said, one at a time. And my son is standing behind the curtain and I'm hearing him talk to my daughter-in-law and he goes, oh yeah, she's gonna be fine. She's yelling. She's yelling at the nurses and the doctors. I was so pissed off because I just thought, you know, a normal person who didn't have a stroke couldn't keep up with all your questions. You know, there was the cardiologist, the neurologist, I don't know who they all were.
That's a really instructful lesson here. I've been part of that party too. And then, we have some fellows in the back that hopefully will have listened to you just then. So.
The person I had the hardest time dealing with was the cardiologist.
I did say that. So like, we're totally unscripted, and
yes, that's right.
I said
I asked you for questions ahead of time.
I said we're unscripted. I feel very vulnerable. I feel more vulnerable. But go ahead.
No, but the reason I say that is that she was a resident, and she harped on me constantly about the fact that that I was non-therapeutic on my Coumadin. And if I could have leaped out of the bed and strangled her or hit her or something, I would have. It wasn't my fault, you know. I just want, So anyway, keep that in mind, okay? If a patient comes in with a stroke who's non-therapeutic, don't yell at them, all right? It's just don't. So anyway, I got out of the ER. They put me in the room. And the next morning, when I woke up, I couldn't move my fingers, and I could move them the night before. And I couldn't move my toes, and I could move them the night before. So I became hysterical, crying, because I thought, oh my God, what happened overnight? You know, like it got worse overnight. And I didn't know that about a stroke. You know, I know so much about stroke now that I didn't know before. And then, so I was in that, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it was Millard Fillmore Gates Hospital, which was the stroke hospital in Buffalo. And anyway, so I was there for 5 or 6 days, and then they transferred me to a hospital much closer to home for my therapy, and I was there for 4 weeks for physical therapy and occupational therapy. And yeah, so through the therapy, I've been able to regain a lot on my left side. When I first got home, I was washing dishes one-handed with my right hand because I couldn't use my left side at all. I try to do it now, and I don't know how I did it. You adapt, you know, you really adapt. So I'm sorry.
No, and tell us a little bit about you're a volunteer for American Stroke Association and do lead some of these stroke survivor groups, or what is that?
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, the American Stroke Association has a program called Sharegivers, and they have a hard time because of HIPAA. They have a hard time finding stroke patients to get to go through this training, but it's a 6-week training, and they prepare you to, as stroke survivors and caregivers, to go out into the hospitals and visit stroke patients to encourage them, just so that they can see that there are people that survive strokes and can ambulate and get around. Sometimes it's a little too soon for some of them, and because my caregiver partner, what happened to my, well anyway, my caregiver partner is much worse off physically than I am.
Okay, it's on.
And I think they get afraid when they see her that that's all they're going to regain. but her stroke was so massive. And the progress that I've seen her make in 2 to 3 years that I've been working with her is phenomenal, but not everybody sees that or knows that, you know. And then I have the problem of people seeing me and they can't believe I've had a stroke because I speak well and, you know, but I am still limited on my left side. I can't get through the airport without wheelchair pushers. I would not be able to travel without them. And the reason I care, the reason I do this is that, well, what got me started was that my son couldn't find work in Buffalo when he graduated he's a mechanical engineer, and he, you know, has lived in Oklahoma City, he's lived in Calgary, and he now lives in Houston. And if I wanted to see him and my grandkids, I had to go to them. And so I just had to bite the bullet and do the travel thing. And when I book my flights, I have to make sure I have an hour and a half if I have a connection. I have to ask for a wheelchair when I check in. I have to ask for a wheelchair when I get on the plane. I have to ask for a wheelchair. You know, like it's a constant thing, but it becomes, you just know, you know, after doing it for so long that it's just something you have to do. It's definitely changed the way I live my life, you know.
And what, do you have any, so as I said, the audience here is, they're dedicated to researching answers for questions that matter for both clinicians and patients. Like, any advice for the group from a patient perspective of what we should do, or what frustrations have you had in the past for the things that physicians have told you, besides the cardiologist?
Yeah. I think the thing that we really hate to hear is you've plateaued. You know, like if you're, I don't know if there are any physical therapists or occupational therapists in here, but when you go through the physical therapy, occupational therapy process, and they tell you you've plateaued, you're not going to get any better, that's just horrible news. You know, it's really, and it's not true. Because there has to be something. And every year in the last 5 years, there's been new stuff that's come out that can help. Like, you know, there are Botox injections that help some people with spasticity. I tried it. It didn't do anything for me. I have spasticity in my leg, pretty severe, which is why I walk with a cane. It's so frustrating, but, you know, I think finally after about the 3rd or 4th year, I just accepted that it's going to be like this, and until something else comes along, you know, I don't know.
Right. Well, no, this has been great. So we'll finish up here, and then we'll open up for questions here, but okay. Thanks for spending some time, especially just getting introduced to this massive group here. So just a little round of applause here. Yeah, you can go back. So I'll be the target for the next few minutes to wind up, and then we'll open it up for questions. So in the last part, I just want to spend a few minutes highlighting some things that are pretty exciting in the outcomes group right now that share similarities to the story that Leslie shared. And this is really engaging patients. And it also, when you look at things like PCORI and what they're aiming to do, it turns out it's very much aligned with what the mission is for the Health Services Research Group, which is advanced innovative health services research improves quality, value, and outcomes of patient-centered care. And we'll actually, if I can advance, well, I may have to do the dance here soon. It turns out when you go and catalog everything that's ongoing in this large group already, is there actually things that we've been doing historically, really before I came here. And it actually addresses all the things that are really hitting the headlines right now: comparative effectiveness research, implementation science, cluster randomized trials, and so forth. And there are 1,000 projects one could pick. This is just highlighting some of the different things, but I wanted to pick a couple that are kind of in the launch phase, if you will, of bringing some of these themes together in terms of comparative effectiveness, safety, patient-reported outcomes. And one is Cascade. And I hope Emily and Matt Rowe don't fail us so I can continue using these slides. But this is really an ambitious project and probably deserves a whole research conference talking about this. And this is truly partnered with patients with the Familial Hypercholesterolemia Foundation Registry that is patient-led. The patient who actually is the president of this foundation first got diagnosed at Duke by John Guyton. And it's coordinated here at DCRI, and it's actually bringing things together, patients who have lots of different needs and interests but don't have the means to address them, nor experience with DCRI and the experience that they have. And so that marriage turns out to be quite interesting because both groups are learning together. The other feature here is actually doing research differently. So going directly to patients, having a portal where patients actually can come through, get their information, and then actually consent for long-term follow-up, as well as the clinical site data collection, which would be more traditional of what we've done, and then combining those two to look at long-term outcomes. Another, which actually has been going on for years, really, is the CARA registry, but with lots of different aims. And now it's actually perfect timing for that group as they transition to some of the things they've done before. And this is led by Laura Sandberg and was recently funded by PCORI and as a patient-powered research network. And what's quite interesting is while the pediatric rheumatologists, the leadership of CARA, have had long-term worries about drugs and safety and so forth, and also have had concerns about how do you actually know this works in pediatric population. It's really come up now, as you can see here, the escalation of the number of therapeutic choices for kids. This is just an example for juvenile JIA. And what this leaves is actually kind of a problem for that community, which is lots of medications, but many questions. Long-term safety, optimal use, which ones to use, what's the patient impact, how does that actually help kids, and what are the things that are potential side effects, and then also limited extrapolation from adult studies. And so these are two examples where we're actually partnering with patients more formally and being able to hear their voice and actually translate that into research and then translate that back into evidence. So I'll just finish up here in that these are themes that at least our group sees as kind of continuing to grow. Everyone says big data, and that's a really big term because there's a lot of things that go behind that. But in a lot of ways, the group here at DCRI has been using big data in terms of registries and then augmentation with Medicare claims and other sources. But now is a chance for us to go really big, leveraging big data with other healthcare systems, taking advantage of things that are being created for PCORNet and things that are here in this house in terms of expertise. And this can translate in terms of addressing important questions, whether it's comparative effectiveness, safety, or post-marketing studies, and then to be filled, the blank. Like there are so many ideas right now that if you have this, this can be addressed. And then importantly, partnering with patients. So not just thinking about what's the academic question, that's great, that's a paper, but what's actually going to be something that has impact on patients? What's going to happen to a population, especially as we get more accountable? And one of the things that we're hoping to do is actually create a patient advisory board for us to help guide us and say, what should be important, what's our true north, what should be on the radar here that we haven't thought of. And then these ideas about registry-based trials, I think everyone can acknowledge that observational studies can't answer every question, but certainly leveraging the resources that we have to do insert randomization and answer questions that are important and easy to address should be done. And so there's a slew of ideas already in the works there, and we'll see soon, over several months, about whether some of those ideas hit. And then translating this back into practice. So while we've focused a lot of quality of care and have driven that thanks to Eric and others, there is really this huge opportunity with new tools, new technologies in terms of implementation science. What are the right things in terms of mHealth or eHealth that actually guide practice, change outcomes? There are so many different ideas, so many apps one can get on a phone, but how do you know what works? And so this is something else I can see us doing, and we'll be able to leverage, say, Prosper as an example of finding out what may work. So with that, I want to say thanks for your attention, and certainly open to questions. Here are my little rugrats. The reason I have to put 3 pictures in is that all 4 boys, they never will cooperate, and so they tend to disrupt any collective moment. So again, thank you.
Folks have any questions?
You can also ask Leslie too.
My question is for Leslie. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations on your great attitude.
Thank you.
I'm a little bit curious about the findings regarding depression. And I would like to know, in your experience and you're reaching out to other patients, do you think that's more that the patients are reluctant to discuss that with the physician, or the physician is reluctant to try and treat that since it's not something that's physically manifested?
Well, in my own personal experience, I was reluctant because I didn't want to be on depression medication or medication for anxiety. I felt like I was already on too many pills, and I wanted to do it myself. But my anxiety became so bad that I was irritable and pretty awful to be around. So I finally, went to my doctor and I said, yeah, I need something. He goes, yeah, I think you do too. So he put me on Cymbalta, which I don't like it because it levels me out so much that I feel like I'm not feeling anything. So I need to talk to him about that. But one of the things that I do like about it is that I don't have as much pain. So that's been a nice side effect, if you want to call it that. So, yeah.
Shelby. It's okay, just...
Okay, so I'm interested to ask you, Adrian, you are in a unique position to be doing a lot of patient-centered outcomes research and also work with a lot of pharmaceutical companies and their development of new drugs. And so what I was wondering is, in your experience with the companies who are historically focused on their primary endpoint to get an FDA label, are they thinking broader about patient-centered outcomes?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting you asked that. So we have a call tomorrow morning actually to on that topic itself with a major pharma that's planning a large cardiovascular outcomes trial. And so one of the things that we had talked about as part of that was saying, how do we do something different? Something that actually we can say this matters for patients. Like, how far do we want to reach there? Like, do we want to have patients part of the steering committee. We want to have a group, because normally we have a traditional executive committee, steering committee, study coordinator committee, but then we do this human experiment where we randomize 10,000 patients, and where are they? And so they're actually very intrigued with that. The two issues that come up, though, in terms of when you push them hard about this, is one is if the regulatory barriers, that if you want something that's going to be in a label and you follow FDA guidance for patient-reported outcomes, then you need to have something that's a validated instrument. And validated instruments under the FDA's eyes is perhaps different than, say, what we would do in the research or clinical community. And so that's one issue. So there's something that needs to change there, perhaps at least be part of a study there. The second thing actually is that they're quite fascinated with the work of Weinfurt here in terms of the iterative patient reported outcomes that are going through the promise tree or whatever. Yeah, computer at that. And one of the things that poses a little bit of a challenge is for them understanding how that would work and whether it would be impactful, and ultimately can they get something like that on a label. So that's one issue. But they're interested. There are actually groups now that are being formed for most of big pharma to do this, but they still haven't figured out how to do that.
One quick question. Thank you very much for sharing your personal story and coming to join us today. And this is a question for both of you. In terms of the primary outcome for your study, how difficult was it for the group to arrive at that? Or was it a natural outcome that everyone kind of resonated for everyone?
Well, so what we did, and it's probably not as rigorous as, like, say, groups would do necessarily, but we went through a list of things that were, of potential interest, and also hearing the stories of patients in terms of what mattered to them. And taking those stories and translating that's something that we can measure is kind of a key step here. So, like, hearing what matters the most, but that it was a common theme qualitatively in terms of how that came about. But the other thing is that there are a lot of outcomes that we'll look at because of what came from the patients, but it's more or less hearing what things matter for the patients. Leslie, any additional comments? Or?
Well, I think I heard from you, or I'm not sure how my name got on the list. I think it was because I was a share giver through the American Stroke Association. And I answered because, when I got the email, that I was very interested. And when I first saw the survey, I was like, are they being backed by a pharmaceutical company or something?
He did tell us like it was completely wrong.
Yeah, I'm not the most tactful person.
Yeah,
but anyway. But yeah, it was pretty much the feeling of my whole stroke support group that, we felt like it needed to be less about the drugs and more about what was important to us, which was, living at home and being independent, and how could we achieve that.
Right.
So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, Adrian, thank you for stepping out of your comfort zone. I think your experiment was a huge success, and I want to thank you again, Leslie, for joining us.
Dr. Hernandez, I noted that the stroke belt and your given guideline stroke hospital belt overlap a lot. Most of what